Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Dean Wright for allowing us to present this program. My name is Amy Niffen, and I am the viola instructor here at Anderson University. I am joined on stage by colleagues of mine from the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra. On violin tonight, we have Melissa Deal and Peter Vickery. And on cello, we have Stephen Hockey, which you might remember him if you were here about this time last year. He played a pretty fabulous recital. So we're happy to welcome all four of us back because we played a concert here as a string quartet last year as well. The program that you hold in your hands has listed on it a group of pieces that don't really seem to go together. They really are an eclectic group of pieces. They came about in conversation with a friend of mine who's a music teacher. Last year, she mentioned how many area high schools study World War II as a unit in history. And I was in the process of beginning to develop programs for an organization that I started, educational music programs to take into schools and talk about one thing and another. And so she mentioned that about World War II, and playing in the Symphony downtown, we occasionally will have a movie music concert. And the Pops director, Jack Everly, will sometimes mention how World War II impacted Hollywood, which is not an automatic connection for most people, but many of the musicians and composers who had to flee Hitler's Germany wound up either conducting for the concert stage or in Hollywood. And so what we understand as the Hollywood sound really has its beginning in Europe. So with those two pieces of information, I started doing some research and thinking about the idea of World War II as a soundtrack. And let me grab my clicker. And what I realized is that there are many eras of history that have a soundtrack that go along with them. If I mention the Roaring Twenties, those are flappers up there in the top left, there's automatically a music that goes along with that. The Charleston was a famous, a popular dance, foxtrot, many other things, jitterbug, and there's music that goes along with that. This gentleman here in the lower left, those of you who don't recognize him, that's Hank Williams Sr. My father was a whistler, and many of the songs that he whistled were Hank Williams tunes. And so it only takes just a few notes of a particular Hank Williams tune, and I can feel like my dad is so nearby. Music is something that really just a little bit of a particular tune that means something to us, and we can be in another time and another place just like that, completely and effectively. Here you see Dr. Martin Luther King and the era of history that is known as the American Civil Rights Movement. There's an obvious anthem that goes along with that. If you think of the American Civil Rights Movement, it's hard to think of that without We Shall Overcome. So I just wanted to preface the introduction of this program that way. When you think of, or when I think of World War II, my first thought is big band music, because big band music was in its heyday in the 1940s. And it is a type of music that America exported all over the world, and there are a number of reasons for that. The first one is just how engaging the music is. It was extremely popular, everybody loved to dance to it, and it's just really fun music. In fact, I lived in New Orleans my first year in school, and the Mardi Gras bands still play tons of big band music. So I got a huge dose of that when I was still pretty young, still kind of young, just not as young as that. But another reason why big band music was really accessible all over the world was because of the technology of the radio. Do people still listen to the radio? Anybody here? most people not so much anymore. But it wasn't new in the 1930s and 40s, but it was kind of new for people to be able to have their own. It was becoming much more affordable. And so this music really made it around the world on the radio airwaves. But there's another reason why big band music in particular wound up being so easily accessible all over the world, and it had to do with the American military. As President Roosevelt saw the country leading up to our involvement in World War II, he recognized that the American servicemen and women were going to need relief services of all sorts on a greater magnitude than really had been seen. And so he went to the individual relief organizations that were in existence at the time, and still are, many of them, the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, many denominational relief services, and asked that they would unite. And that is how the USO, the United Services Organization, came to be and still exists to support American men and women, military men and women, wherever they are around the world, because he knew that they would need the help as they crossed the country reporting for duty. And immediately there were, in train stations and bus stations and city gathering places, places where service people could go to get a cup of coffee, a sandwich, a friendly smile, a word of encouragement. For many of these people were very young, 18-year-old leaving home for the first time. And it's important to remember that during a time when food was being rationed, a lot of these sandwiches were coming out of a city, a small town, out of their own resources. And so it really was a remarkable source of support for the servicemen and women. But on top of that, President Roosevelt was aware of the power of the arts to sway the American public and to support the troops. And he went to Hollywood and the recording studios and the singers and songwriters and movers and shakers in the entertainment industry and asked them to support the war effort as well. And how that relates to the American military is that many actors and actresses, musicians, bands, entertainers, comedians of all sorts wound up going to the troops. The USO would organize camp shows, and these entertainers would go wherever the service people were, and they didn't hesitate to get pretty close to action. In fact, some of them died because of how close they were to the action, but it was considered extremely important for the morale of the troops for them to have a little taste of home. And so many entertainers, and part of the people who went were big bands like Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller and many others. And it was a very important morale boost for the troops. But the closer they got to enemy lines, the more jazz music in particular became part of the resistance, because Hitler had classified jazz music as degenerate officially, because it was known to be the genesis of this music was known to have come from the community of color, and it was frequently performed by Jewish musicians. And for those two reasons, he classified jazz as not acceptable for entertainment for the Aryan race. And so the closer this music got, and even behind, it was actually very popular in Germany during World War II, but it had to be enjoyed in secret. The closer it got to the lines, it was yes, a morale boost for the military, but it was also a little bit of finger in the eye to Hitler. So it served a dual purpose. Well, one of the main signature tunes of the big band era is called Sing, 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 and it was written by Louis Prima, who is the gentleman up there in the left-hand corner with the trumpet. How many people are familiar with jazz great Louis Prima? Raise your hand. Okay, I see a few hands. Okay, everybody else who did not raise your hand, how many of you saw the animated version of Jungle Book when you were little? Do you remember this? Okay, anybody remember King Louis, the King of the Apes? That was voiced by Louis Prima, who had a remarkable 50, 60-year career as a jazz musician. You should look him up. He was pretty amazing. Well, he was the one that wrote Sing Sing Sing, but Benny Goodman, the gentleman right there with the clarinet right at the top, Benny Goodman was the one who recorded it in 1938. Benny Goodman was a good Jewish boy, one of these Jewish musicians playing jazz that Hitler did not approve of. And from his background, he was no stranger to discrimination because his parents had immigrated from Russia to escape anti-Semitism. They landed in Chicago. He studied with a Chicago symphony clarinetist, but he needed to leave school at 15 when his father died to help support his 11 brothers and sisters. And he enjoyed a pretty meteoric rise to fame. And when he got to that level of fame, he did not hesitate to hire musicians of color into his band. He said, if a guy's got it, let him give it. I'm making music, not prejudice. And so he hired Lionel Hampton on vibes. He hired Teddy Wilson on drums. And it was because of him being willing to have an integrated band, integrated jazz orchestra is what they're called at the time, that integrated bands became more mainstream. Well, in 1938, he recorded Sing Sing Sing, and the drummer at that time was Gene Krupa, who's the gentleman right there with the mallets going nuts. And Gene Krupa wasn't ready for the song to be over when they were recording it, so he kept going. And Benny eventually walked back over to him, started playing, and one by one, the rest of the band came over and started playing as well. And the tape kept going, except there wasn't such a thing as a tape at the time. They were recording on 78s. And this, which is a record, this thing right here in the middle, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that's a record player. It's actually a phonograph. And the records at the time could only hold 4 minutes of music on one side. So in order to play this record, you had to actually pick up the record, turn it over, and play it on the B side. How many people remember doing this with records? Yeah, I had them too when I was a little kid. So Benny Goodman is the one who brought this tune to the level of fame that it was. He also the one who brought jazz music to Carnegie Hall. Jazz had never been played in Carnegie before. Carnegie had been a bastion of classical music at that point, and Benny Goodman practically brought the house down. And as you see, we are not a jazz band. We are a string quartet. And they didn't teach us jazz at conservatory. So we're doing our best with Sing Sing Sing. And when I was a kid, my mom liked to watch Lawrence Welk. I wanted to watch Wonder Woman. It came on at the same time, but mom wanted to watch Lawrence Welk. So in the words of her favorite band leader, we're doing a wonderful, wonderful job of trying to swing. Here's Sing Sing Sing. Not too bad for conservatory. Oops. I think I just turned it off. There we are. The next piece that we have on our program is by American composer Samuel Barber, who during World War II was known as Corporal Samuel Barber. He was drafted in 1942 into the Army and transferred into the Army Air Corps in 1943. And fortunately, his commanding general was of the same opinion of the president at the time, which was that his talents could be much better used in support of the troops for morale, instead of using him as a soldier specifically. And so during his enlistment, that's what he did. He wrote music for his fellow soldiers. He wrote marches and different things. He flew with them so that he could see what they had to do on a daily basis. And his Second Symphony is actually dedicated to the Army Air Corps and includes a particular kind of siren that was used on the plane, a sound that would only be found on the plane. In 1936, Barber had written a string quartet, and the slow movement of that string quartet is by many people associated with the Vietnam War because it was part of the soundtrack for a movie called Platoon. And the music is such a powerful expression of angst and tragedy that accompanying this scene, this battle scene, there were veterans who went to see Platoon who were so triggered by the power of the scene with the music that they actually had to leave the theater. That's how powerful this piece of music is. But it wasn't written anywhere near the Vietnam War. It wasn't written in relation to the Vietnam War. It was written in 1936, and he excerpted this and arranged it for string orchestra. And the conductor of the NBC Orchestra, this gentleman right here that you see on this stamp, was Arturo Toscanini. And he, with the NBC Orchestra, premiered this on radio broadcast. And Toscanini already had lost many of his Jewish European colleagues because of the war at that point. So this piece was to him an expression of the grief that is an obvious and necessary part of war. This particular piece has become synonymous with extreme mourning and national mourning in certain circumstances. It was used for the funeral of FDR as well as JFK. I've played it at Good Friday services before, which is a little hard to do. The orchestra gave a concert after September 11th happened years ago to try to help the community begin to process some of the reaction to that, and this was part of that concert as well. So I think it's appropriate in addressing the soundtrack of a war that we play something, the thing that to me most expresses the grief of the tragedy of war, because even a war fought for the most just of causes, it's going to have its price, and this is a very effective expression of that. Next, we have a piece of music that is actually a quintet, and I'll explain the fifth member of our quintet momentarily. American composer Steve Reich is still with us. He was a baby during World War II, and in the 1980s, it occurred to him that as a Jewish child on an American train, his parents were divorced, and so he traveled from New York to LA on trains with his governess, Virginia. And he was thinking if, as the Jewish child that he was, he had been on a train in Europe, what a different experience it would be. And so he wanted to write a piece of music that would really encapsulate this experience for him as a small child. And so he recorded trains from America and Europe from that era, the 1930s, 1940s, and he recorded the voices of his governess, Virginia, as well as a Pullman porter, and he took the snippets of their speech and excerpted the pitch and the rhythm, and those are the parts that we will play. So in addition to the train sounds and the voices that he recorded, there is on a recording that will be played along with us, there are three string quartets. And so the fifth member of our ensemble is right back there in the booth, is Torin Carter, and he graciously rehearsed with us earlier today and helped it be all right that we weren't quite so freaked out about this whole experience. We're still freaked out, just not quite as much as we were before. But the experience that you see, here's a Pullman porter, in case you weren't aware. That is the person who would carry your luggage and help you find your seat, much like an usher in a hall. And this is a picture of a Pullman train. You see a very happy-looking, lush-colored photo of a family, and they're happy, and there's the Pullman porter helping them out. That's the train that he would have been on here in America, and I hope it's not too stark a contrast if he were in Europe as a Jewish baby. There's a picture of a very different kind of train that he might have ridden. And so this piece is what we call minimalist. It is very repetitive. And if you listen to it with any sense of harmonic rhythm, like you want something to resolve to something else and finally you get to the end of your piece, then this kind of music can be very frustrating. This is more of this is more of a soundscape. You'll hear the sound of the train whistles. You'll hear the sound of the voices. You'll hear the sound of the train. We're imitating that sometimes. We're imitating the train whistles. And this, if you think about it from the point of view of the baby that was on that train, what that baby would have felt, what that baby would have understood. That baby was in the arms of someone that he trusted. That baby felt the motion of the train and heard the train whistle, which was probably at least a little bit distressing to a baby that it didn't understand what it was. So you have tension and alarm along with a familiar voice and a rhythm that can perhaps lull you to sleep or jolt you out of sleep, depending on where you are in the trip. So if you listen to this, and it goes on for a little while, but if you listen to this from that point of view, you can begin to get a sense of what it might have been like to be that baby on that train, which is what the composer was going for. Here is Different Trains, the first movement, America Before the War. I'd like to acknowledge Torrin Carter as well. Round of applause for the fifth member of our ensemble. He's the unforgiving one. Once the tape gets started, you just got to make it work. So the next piece that we have on our program and our soundtrack. Good morning. There we are. Is a piece by a composer who was known all throughout Europe as the golden child of Europe in the early part of the 1900s. He was an actual composing prodigy. We're familiar with Mozart as a prodigy, but that was largely on piano and violin, or keyboard and violin at the time. Composition came slightly later for him. Erich Korngold, on the other hand, at 11, wrote his first, I can't remember if it was a ballet or an opera, but at any rate, it was hailed as quite the remarkable composition. He was writing operas by the time he was 19. His pieces were being played by the finest ensembles in Europe. He was hailed by people like Gustav Mahler and Richard Strauss, who could highly recommend him to any post that he was interested in. He was extremely popular, extremely successful. He had an alpine estate in Austria and a villa in Vienna. Really, the world was his oyster. And he was naive enough to not really be paying attention to what was going on in Hitler's Germany, but his father was. And a composer by the name of Max Reinhardt, who was active in Hollywood, was also. And they had contrived to get Korngold to Hollywood to work on a score in the 1930s. And that's why he was there at the time of the Anschluss in Austria. And so he stayed in Hollywood for 12 years, and he scored 16 films. And come to find out, he was extremely adept at watching a film, and he would score it the same way he did for his operas. There were many composers that had fled, composers and musicians that had fled Hitler's Germany, and many of them did wind up in Hollywood, but they were doing the grunt work of orchestrating and copying out and doing all these sort of things. Not Korngold. He was given his own studio to do with as he wanted, and he would watch the screen and sit at his piano and come up with his ideas, and he could voice a particular character. He took a page out of the composer Wagner's book and wrote a signature tune for each character in the movie, or a particular happening or a particular place. Each one got its own motive. And he would work those motives together or separately, or put it in major key or minor key or whatever to give an indication of what was going on in the music. And he could really time the music of a scene. And his music, at a time when serious Austrian composers were moving in the direction of atonality, his inner voice said to stick with tonality. And there was an attitude against him for that reason, but his music was flamboyantly tonal and just really larger than life, and it lent itself well to many of the scores that he was given to write for. The Errol Flynn, Robin Hood, if anybody has ever seen that one, that's a Korngold score. Captain Blood, the Seahawk, these kind of swashbuckling adventures where people are fighting with swords and, high and mighty on the seas and all of this. This kind of music was very Korngold. I mean, he also wrote some concerti. There's one for violin and one for cello. And a friend of mine played the cello concerto a long time ago, and he walked out on stage and he sat himself down and did a flip of his hair and it just works for a concerto like the Korngold concerto. It really is, a no-holds-barred sort of piece of music. Sadly, there are not any string quartet versions of the Seahawk or Captain Blood, but fortunately, I'm not sure actually we'd be able to play them, because all of the people that were in those Hollywood orchestras many of them were also people who had escaped from from Europe at the time. And if you go back and listen to any of those movies from the golden age of Hollywood, listen to the scores, listen to the string playing in particular. It's really remarkable. However, Korngold did write three string quartets, and we are going to play the finale to string quartet number 3. And it's not a far jump from music like Robin Hood and the Seahawk and Captain Blood to this particular piece of music. It's quite flamboyant. It's a lot of fun to play. And I think it's not very hard to imagine people with swords and high adventure in the middle of this music. So this is the finale to String Quartet number 3 by Eric Korngold. We have one more short piece for you, really kind of an encore. Really doesn't have a lot to do with World War II, but it does, it does show you the lasting impact that Korngold had on the Hollywood movie musical. It had fallen somewhat into out of favor in the 60s, and when Sound of Music was done, it single-handedly kind of revived the genre of the Hollywood musical. But in the early 70s, John Williams was given the job of writing for Jaws, and we're still familiar all these years later with that soundtrack. And then he was given the job of writing for Star Wars. And Lucas specifically wanted not the kind of soundtrack that was beginning to be popular, the computerized sort of synthesizer soundtrack, very futuristic sort of thing. He wanted to go back to the Hollywood musical, and John Williams really took a page out of Korngold's book, almost literally. If you go to YouTube and look up the Korngold, the main theme to his movie called King's Row, you will hear a piece of music that sounds remarkably similar to this one that we're about to play. John Williams, for the main title of Star Wars, on purpose pays homage to Korngold in particular, and he does the same thing. We're all familiar with this. Leia has a theme, Luke has a theme, Han Solo has a theme. They all have, of course we know Darth Vader, you know, he's got a very famous theme. They all have their own motive, just the same way that Korngold wrote specific motives for his characters, the same way that Wagner had written characters. It's all the same idea, and Wagner and Korngold are the people that John Williams got the idea from. So we're just going to play a short snippet of Star Wars. Listen to this main title, and then later tonight look up King's Row, the main title. I think you'll be amused or surprised or impressed or something to hear how very similar they are. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for paying such good attention to us. We really appreciate your presence here. Have a good night.